Oh God, I've lost it. I forgot how to do the thing. Stop. Stop. And stop. Okay. Hey, everybody. This is Dillon Naber Cruz, the Tattooed Theologian here. I am not a producer, as you can see, with all the technical glitches and so forth, but we are here, and I am delighted to be joined tonight by the Right Reverend Dr. Elle Dowd, whose biography I had somewhere. She is the author of Baptized in Teargas, and she just completed a PhD from Chicago Theological Seminary. She is an activist, a mom, a pastor, and our guest tonight, Reverend Dr. Elle Dowd. Thank you so much for joining us tonight here on the God Squad pod.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's really good to be here.
Well, first of all, congratulations on getting your PhD in queer theology. From Chicago Theological Seminary. Welcome to not being a student, I guess, at least for a minute. That's probably got to feel really good, right?
Yes. Yeah. It feels a little surreal. Like, okay, now, now what? I didn't realize until graduation how much like static in the back of your head is always like, I should be writing, all the time. And so now it's like, oh, some of that has, obviously life is still very busy, but some of that has quieted. And it's like, wow, that was a lot.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, I've never written a dissertation, but I wrote my master's thesis at a time when my advisor said, don't write your thesis while you're taking a full load. And I wrote my thesis while I was taking a full load. And
wow.
Turned it in early, and it was about 3 times longer than it needed to be because that's how I roll. So academia is wonderful and also stressful and incredible. And I saw you wielding a sword, which I didn't get a sword for my master's degree. I feel, maybe they should have given me at least a dagger or something.
They should have. Yeah, the story on that was it was like a couple years ago or something. I saw, something in my like feed or something, like some meme or like tweet or something that was like that I now know it was Finland, but I didn't even remember this, but like in some other country, if you get a PhD, they like give you a sword. And so I like had sent that to my partner, Adam, and been like, that's pretty cool, or whatever. Like, oh wow, that's so fun. And I guess he immediately purchased a sword, which they presented to me at my graduation party, which was really fun. So it was cool.
Outstanding. Okay, well, I read your book this week, Baptized in Teargas, From White Moderate to Abolitionist. We have some parallels because we both grew up in sort of very white context. You grew up in Iowa, which for those who don't know stands for I ought to win a round. Just kidding. I kid. I lived in Iowa for a while and I did not like it. But I grew up in North Texas in an all-white town. Essentially, there were 4 people from Mexico, and then there were all the white people. And then one African-American kid showed up in the mid-'80s and got death threats because it was Blue Ridge, Texas, and Black people didn't go to Blue Ridge, Texas as a general rule. But I didn't think I was racist growing up, right?
Of course not.
Because, and whatnot. But I learned later as an adult, and I can remember in 1994, I was working on a farm, and the boss did some pretty messed up stuff, and I was feeling some kind of way about it.
Yeah.
And out of my mouth came an expression that I will not repeat here that I had heard racist people make. And I said it. And that was in 1994. And it's 2026 now. And I still remember that Dillon said that.
Yeah.
And that was inside of me. And I didn't think that it was inside of me. And I've had to do a lot of work. And as my New Testament professor, Dr. Greg Carey, said in class one day, he's a white professor from Alabama. He's like, I don't think we ever get done with learning to be anti-racist as white people in America. And as I read book, I reflected on him saying that, and I realized that, I didn't disagree with him. But as I read your book, it became even more poignant that until we dismantle white supremacy in this country and systemic racism,
Mm-hmm.
we're never going to fucking be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was, one of there was a lot of reasons I thought that this book might be a little controversial in church circles, but one that I underestimated was there were some people who were really upset that I used with the title "Baptized in Teargas," like I was like it was sort of like sacrilegious or something, but or blasphemy or like not taking baptism seriously. And actually, for me, it wasn't like just supposed to be some like, incendiary title or something, but that the baptismal journey was the best way that I could understand the journey of anti-racism, right? It's this, for in Lutheran theology, right? There's this moment where you're baptized, the actual initiation moment where the water is sprinkled on you or you're dunked, depending on, the situation. And that's like maybe one moment, but actually the baptismal journey is something that we're on for the rest of our lives. And Martin Luther calls it daily dying and rising. So every morning, sort of waking up and recommitting to our baptismal journey. And that's how I experience anti-racism as a white person is, yeah, like you said, it's not something that we just arrive and that we're done. It's a system bigger than ourselves that we're sort of captive to, and it is all around us, but also makes its way inside of us because there's been generations of propaganda that we're influenced by consciously and subconsciously, unconsciously. And so it takes active daily effort, which is why I was also really clear when I wrote the book that I'm not like some kind of anti-racist expert or something. Like I always try to like clarify that. I don't really think maybe white people are able to be anti-racist experts, right? I think that BIPOC people really are the leaders in that. But even if there were white anti-racist experts, I just never really, that's not the angle that I was coming at writing the book. I was more hoping to be like a companion on the journey of like, here's where I'm at and my experiences. Here's the mistakes I learned along the way. Here's the generous, gracious Black activists and revolutionaries who taught me, and maybe I can be a bridge and for some other white people who are struggling or learning or wanting to broaden their horizons and work towards anti-racism on this journey as well.
Yeah, I thought the title was fantastic. I have never had police throw tear gas at me, but when I was in Marine Corps boot camp, and I'm sure your husband, when he went through Army training, went through the gas chamber, and what they use is CS gas, which is T90. The gas mask didn't have filters, they didn't have eyepieces, they were dry rotted, and so basically for a long time you were subjected to a closed room full of tear gas where they're making you do jumping jacks and then say your name and social security number and everything, and it was horrific. It was traumatizing in some ways to
it's
have
chemical weapons, right?
It's chemical weapons.
Yeah.
So to hear and to know the experiences of, sort of secondhand of what people like yourself, but more importantly, the African American people and the Mexican American people and other immigrants during the ICE Gestapo shit show that's been going on in the United States of late. It's sobering and disgusting and distressing and all of that. Early in the book, you mentioned that white kids don't have the police talk, and it immediately brought to mind, before I moved to Texas, close to my 12th birthday, I was living in Kansas City, on the other side of the state from Ferguson, where your journey took place. Kansas City also very racially segregated. If you were on one side of Troost Avenue, things were probably pretty good for yourself, and if you were on the other side, well, then not so much. But the Kansas City Metro Police would hand out Kansas City Chiefs football cards to little kids if kids would go up and ask them for them. And I
Yeah.
thought today, like, I used to go up and see them and say, hey, do you got any cards or whatever? And it was supposed to build goodwill. But I wondered today if
Mhm.
on the other side of Troost Avenue, if that was happening in the
Right.
neighborhoods that were predominantly African American neighborhoods. And I don't know the answer to that, but I kind of doubt it
Yeah.
because I,
Well, what I'll say is when there's been a big push, when there's been a big push for reform and a move more towards community policing, there's been a
yeah,
lot of programs like that, even in sort of over policed areas or in Black areas. And that was happening in Ferguson and St. Louis. So even,
oh, okay,
every, not every maybe, but most cities have that street that's sort of famous in the area. That's like the dividing line. That's like the major segregation line. In St. Louis, it's Del Mar. But yeah, in St. Louis, even during and around the Ferguson uprising, there would be like events of like ice cream with police, or the police want to
right,
play basketball with the kids. And I think a few things are going on there, as that was something that before the Ferguson uprising, I would have found really heartwarming, right? Because
right,
even before that, I understood that there were systemic problems in policing, but I was really naive about the way institutionally and systemically racism and white supremacy actually play out in the function of state violence. Um,
hmm,
I think I thought that once everybody sort of just got to know each other, things would be better, which is, there is some truth to that, right? When you know your neighbor, you have relationships with your neighbor, it can be very transformative. And in fact, a lot of the book is about that for me, right? That once
sure,
I had these relationships with these radical Black activists, I was really, really changed by their experiences. So I believe in the transformative power of relationships. And so in some ways, I know why the sort of push towards community policing of like, let's have more cops walking the beat. Let's have more cops living where they are working. Let's have more cops handing out baseball cards, playing basketball with the kids. But once I saw what was going on with Ferguson and in St. Louis, what I actually began to recognize was that this wasn't actually a truly sincere, genuine gesture of building relationship across difference. It's a propaganda move, right? So a lot of
right,
times we call the sort of police-driven propaganda, we call it propaganda. Um,
yeah,
and so as a parent of Black kids, I was like, the hope here, the message that that the police are trying to send is, we're the good guys, right? Like, you can trust us. And I don't want my kids to trust their abusers, right? It actually
right,
puts them in harm's way. I don't want police to sort of earn the trust of marginalized populations and vulnerable people. Um, I want our structure of public safety to actually be trustworthy, right? Not just the sort of illusion of building trust and then continuing the systemic violence and oppression, but a better system that reform can't provide, where we actually have public safety that is about actual trust and actual relationships, instead of sort of paving over, all of this bloodshed with ice cream and basketball games.
right, yeah. I can remember when a moment like that happened for me because I grew up in fundamentalism, Southern Baptist and Church of Christ,
Okay.
and two of the whitest Christian groups in America, in my opinion,
Mhm.
hyper conservative. I literally never saw a person of color in any service that I went to. And when I started my undergraduate work as a later uh, student, I was in my late 20s when I started. I had to
Mhm.
argue in an English class a randomly assigned debate topic.
Mhm.
And I pulled out of the professor's hat, the war on drugs is positive and works well, or something along those lines. And I was like,
Right.
yeah, because I was, I was
Oh,
watching
yeah.
Fox News and I was a
Yeah.
Republican all the way because I didn't have any
Right.
fucking critical thinking skills.
Well,
And
even
then,
me, I was always like, I grew up in Iowa's an interesting case study, because now Iowa is much more conservative than when I was growing up. But
oh, okay,
Iowa went blue in a lot of the national elections until about 2016. But I would say I was never like super conservative, but the zeitgeist of the moment, right, of the 90s, the early 2000s, Bush, all that stuff, the sort of zeitgeist of the moment that was that even for people who were in the mainline, or even for people who weren't like evangelical, the evangelical ethos sort of like seeped into and contaminated a lot of that. So for me, I was never like, I mean, there's maybe a few issues that I was maybe more conservative on, and I was definitely more conservative than I am now, but I was never like a conservative. But
Right.
even for me, it's like all we were exposed to was dare and just say no, right? We weren't exposed to ideas around like harm reduction. We weren't exposed to ideas about the ways that the war on drugs was racist on every single level. Like we just didn't even know to know those questions, ask those questions, or know those things because they weren't affecting us in a direct way. And all we were hearing was propaganda. Like it's millions and millions of dollars of propaganda. So yeah, so you got to argue that the war on drugs was a positive thing, and now I'm sure you feel differently about that.
Well, what happened was I went to the library to do the research, and I couldn't find anything that supported that point.
Yeah.
And so in all of the pages and pages of reports and things that I read, I found one line that hinted sort of that there might be some kind of benefit. And during the debate, that's the only thing I talked about.
Yeah.
Like a good little Fox News watcher. And it was a seminal moment. I didn't suddenly become progressive all of a sudden, right? But it was one of those seed planting moments.
Yeah.
And then just learning to think critically, which is why they hate humanities education on the right. They just hate it because it teaches people to think critically. It doesn't tell them what to think, tells them how.
Yeah.
And so that was part of my education, and then learning about the Middle Passage, like really learning about what that was all about and how the enslavement of African descended peoples and the horrors thereof built the country. And then things started to unravel, and then it wasn't very long before I was in an untenable situation in a fundamentalist marriage that I could no longer support.
And it's so interesting because obviously, the book is about my experiences with Ferguson, but there's also, I think in the book I mentioned that education was part of cracking that open for me too, right? I was really grateful and lucky to have some shout out to Sarah Zdenek if you're listening. I had an awesome English teacher who sort of recognized, even though I wasn't calling myself a feminist, like some budding feminism in me in high school, and like handed me a lot of like womanist literature. And so that really formed me, and that helped me to start asking those questions. But what's dawning on me as we're having this conversation is that like on the one hand, it's like it's really interesting and shows the importance of this kind of education to broaden people's horizons. And also it also sort of like, as you were saying earlier, kind of like belies the privilege of like, this is not generations of harm that we're carrying in our bodies. This is not stories that our ancestors are passing on to us about the harm and the violence and the way that it's like continued to, affect us personally. This is something we're have the privilege to sort of learn about secondhand, thirdhand. And it's a really different experience to kind of learn academically and have that open your heart versus to be like living it day in and day out, and to be born into a situation where there's no other alternative. Like that's just your reality.
Yeah. And the education piece is important, particularly for folks that look like you and me.
Yeah,
we have to start somewhere, and for a lot of us, that's where we start. And it's also building relationships across racial boundaries and economic boundaries. And as I've heard activists say, like Simon Moya Smith is an indigenous and Chicano activist, say, you got to put your body in the movement. And see, but it doesn't matter how many books I read or how many actions I go to. I will never know what it's like to walk down the street and exist while Black in America. And that's something that only Black people can experience.
Mm-hmm.
After the Pulse shooting in 2016, I think it was 2016, I
Yes.
decided to wear a skirt to Pride. I'm
Mm.
6'2". At the time, my beard looked like, Grizzly Adams. I had a long pony. My hair was probably as long as yours is now.
Yeah.
Um, and I walked 2 miles through a pretty conservative city in that skirt, and it terrified me. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
former Marine, and I
Mm-hmm.
was scared kind of witless because I didn't know if some homophobic jackass was going to pull up in a truck and, jump
Right.
out and beat me up just for wearing a garment, right?
Yeah.
And and in that sense, I could momentarily embody because I chose to dress like somebody who was probably queer, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
most 6'2" white dudes don't wear long red flowing skirts on a regular
You
basis.
should
Although
really
they
try
should.
it 'cause it's so
They
fun.
should.
Yeah.
They're comfortable as hell,
Yeah.
like especially when it's hot out.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't know that what it's like to be an African American.
Right.
I can't know what it's like to be um, a Latin immigrant, even though my last name's Cruz. I took the last name of my ex-wife when we got married, and she's Puerto Rican. So, like, I can't embody those things, and I think one of the beautiful things and challenging things about the book is your kind of realizations that you were having as you were getting involved uh, in the uprising in Ferguson,
Yeah.
and the vulnerable way in which you shared sort of your mistakes
Mm-hmm.
and so forth, as being a white person.
Yeah.
And one of those areas was talking about what is violence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I am aspirationally a pacifist. I haven't punched anybody since like junior high, even though I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps. Um, but I also don't know what I would do if push came to shove, if I saw people doing things that were harmful and hurting others.
Mm-hmm.
So, now that you've gone through this baptism by tear gas,
Mm-hmm.
and put your body very literally in the movement, what do you see as violence, and why is niceness sometimes toxic?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so before, and this is something that's still in me, right? Like this is something these are instincts I still find myself struggling with. Even recently, like back in, I think it was November, I had an arrest outside of Broadview, which is the ICE detention facility nearby in the Chicagoland area. And the next morning, like after my release, I remember talking to Adam and just being like, did I do something wrong? Like there was something in me that was like feeling so guilty, even though I was really clear about why I was present and why it was
Hmm.
important to be there. But again, it's years and decades of socialization of propaganda, which is like telling us like it's really important to be nice and to obey authority, right? And maybe even the sort of like belief that I don't have, but is still subconsciously present of like only sort of bad people get arrested, right? So I'll give
Mm-hmm.
that disclaimer before I like talk about this, that this is still something that I struggle with because we're trained in a certain way. We're trained. And I think that's like a white culture thing, the sort of like discomfort with discomfort, right?
Right. Yeah.
And discomfort. And it's also a very gendered thing that people who are women or femmes are like really socialized to sort of care for other people and center other people and cater to other people, make other people comfortable. But yeah, so I came to Ferguson and St. Louis and the uprising, and there were things that at the time really struck me as violent. So one thing that really struck me as violent, which now I find ridiculous, is that there were people standing in the street. I became one of these people eventually, but there were people standing in the street when the police were telling them to not stand in the street, right?
Hmm.
And at the time, hearing people sort of not obey authority felt really violent to me.
Mm.
Like, these are the people in charge and you're supposed to listen, right? Um,
Right.
Now it's pretty clear to me that there's nothing violent about standing in the street, especially, I mean, ever really, but especially if the reason you're standing in the street is because blood is running through the streets, because people who are armed agents of the state are killing your community members, then in fact, it's not violent to stand in the street. It's actually anti-violent to stand in the street. But I think white people have been so conditioned to think of anything that's not nice or anything that makes us uncomfortable, anything that challenges a dominant narrative, anything that sort of like pushes up against some of our propaganda that we've internalized. We've sort of been trained to mistake being uncomfortable with violence, right? Standing in the street when the police say no could be violence, or breaking a window could be violence. There was definitely, and it was a while that before I was able to sort of work through this in my head. But there was a long time that it really felt like property damage to me was violence. And now
Right.
I have a little bit more context for that. I think that there's times when property damage can be violence. So in the case of, say, like lighting Black churches on fire, right? That's violence, that's property damage, but it's not just because of the property damage, it's because of the psychological terror and the threat of racialized violence tied to the sort of like larger context. But breaking a window is not necessarily violence, especially if bodies are being broken in the streets, right? So we can replace windows and we can't replace human beings. And so I started to learn about the ways that violence exists all around us, but because of this propaganda that we've internalized, some of that violence becomes invisible. So people being denied healthcare and people dying because they can't have healthcare. People who have to sit here and count the cost of, do I pay for my medication or do I pay for my light bill, right? Even
Right.
putting people in that situation in the quote unquote richest country on earth, that is violence. It is violent that people don't have their basic needs being met while elites have more than they could ever even possibly enjoy, right? So,
Right.
so many things that are violent, but the state and the ruling elite are sort of given a monopoly on violence. And so because we've gotten so used to that violence, it's normal for people to be homeless. It's normal for people to be hungry. It's normal for people not to have healthcare. Those things seem sad to us, but we don't see them or experience them in the same way as violence, because the state, who has the authority, has basically just told us that's okay. That's just the way it is. And so many of us who are white sort of experience that disruption when people push back against that as violence, when it's really quite the opposite. So yeah, it's that niceness and sort of lack of ability to feel discomfort, lack of endurance for discomfort that really enables true violence, the state violence, white supremacy as violence. It's kind of like that white niceness and wanting to just all get along and wanting to
Right.
authority. That's really what's propping up the violence that we think of as white supremacy or state violence.
Yeah. Whenever I type the word capitalism in my phone,
Mm-hmm.
the predictive text immediately says kills, because that's how I feel about capitalism. I
Yeah.
think that it intentionally puts people in harm and intentionally kills people. And
Yes.
that's why we have things like warehouses being set on fire by somebody saying all you had to do is pay us enough to live,
Yep.
or Luigi Mangione
Mm-hmm.
deciding that vigilante violence is the way forward.
Right.
Um, and so and I don't know if you've ever read Edward R. Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told,
Mm-mm.
Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism.
Mm-mm.
But he does a brilliant job. He's a Cornell University historian of showing how the enslavement of African descended peoples and the brutality of that enslavement increased production,
Mm-hmm.
because the human beings that were enslaved were being driven further and further and further by threats of violence, threats of rape, all of the horrific things of slavery, and that helped build
Mm-hmm.
American capitalism into this seeming monolith that it is today. So white supremacy and capitalism in the United States definitely go hand in hand.
Yep. Yeah. And, Karl Marx talks about this a little bit, that the way that capitalism functions is that workers have to be coerced into providing our labor. And
Right.
That's why we're often alienated from our labor, is because we're sort of doing it with a proverbial gun to our heads, because it's like, if you don't work in the United States, you don't get health care, right? If you don't work, you don't get housing, your kids are homeless, you starve to death. So there's like this threat of violence. And capitalism, because of that, depends on creating underclasses of people and whole categories of people that they torture, so that there's an example to point to, right? Of like, keep working, keep allowing this exploitation to continue. Otherwise, you'll be like this, right? Keep working. Don't overthrow your overlords. Otherwise, look at what happens. Look at what happens if you don't comply. You will be out on the street. And of course, like you said, there's like a very clear through line to slavery with that, and to the racialized capitalism in the United States in particular, because of slavery, because of the genocide of indigenous peoples. Like, racism and capitalism, as you said, in the United States in particular, are really like one and the same. They function together, and so they are so intertwined that to dismantle one, you have to dismantle both. And I'd argue that's also true of patriarchy, which functions a little bit differently, but also has some really important economic and racialized considerations.
Yes, yeah, especially in the reformed Theo Bro internet space that we talk about on this show a lot. I do a segment called Fundamentalist Fuckwittery when we don't have guests. And I highlight people like Dale Partridge or Joel Webon or Doug Wilson or, those kinds of patriarchal troglodytes. I don't know any other word for them.
Yes.
There's a quote. It's for white people. And it says, "Today, if we do not act with each breath to tear down every vestige of the death cult of white supremacy, we betray the gospel of Jesus Christ."
Yeah.
That's a line I wish I had written, because it's brilliant and it's true. So how do you see the gospel contra white supremacy? From because this is a Christian perspective, specifically Christian perspective.
Yeah. The book is like a very theological reflection, right? It's like kind of memoir, kind of theological reflection, kind of love letter to my comrades there in St. Louis and Ferguson. So there's a lot of reasons that the gospel is contrary to white supremacy. And a major one is that we believe that all people are made in the image and likeness of God, right? And so that should be an equalizer. It shouldn't make all of us sort of like equally God's children, equally beloved. And white supremacy doesn't allow for that. It stratifies people. And when we're stratifying peoples, we're also dividing them. And so that's one of the ways that white supremacy also hurts white people. So obviously the intended targets of white supremacy are people of color, and Black people are particular targets, and Indigenous people are particular targets. In other ways, all people of color, it sort of functions differently. But, the intended targets of white supremacy are people of color. And yet, even though white supremacy is set up to benefit white people, there's a lot of ways that it harms us, right? We have broken relationships with our siblings because of white supremacy. So we don't have the sort of genuine relationships with people of color, which means that because people of color are made in the image and likeness of God, we are not experiencing and seeing God fully. So it keeps us from the fullness of understanding God, because we don't understand and love our neighbor fully. And it also alienates us from ourselves and puts us contrary to the gospel. And I'd say another way that white supremacy is contrary to the gospel is because of their very personhood of Jesus Christ, who was a brown person in occupied land, and who was a religious minority, and who was executed by the state. And so, as James Cone, of course, and many others have written, but James Cone in particular writes of the ways that the cross and the lynching tree are so similar. right? There are these agents of psychological terror. They're agents of they're instruments of terror and execution, state violence, and if we cannot recognize the way that the same patterns that killed Jesus are continuing to crucify people in our midst today, then we're not experiencing the gospel all around us. So yeah, white supremacy is, you know, I think a lot about how those of us who are Christians think of God as incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ, which is a wild idea, right? This like cosmic, universal, eternal, omnipresent being who then becomes sort of like finite and particular, this universal becoming very particular in a person of Jesus, and who was born into a particular time in a particular place with a place with history, a place with politics and socioeconomic backgrounds. So just as sort of God becomes incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ, I think that in every generation and in different cultural contexts, evil incarnates in different ways as well. So in our current context in the United States, one of the main ways that we see evil incarnate is the demon of white supremacy, right? In our culture, we don't necessarily see or understand, in white culture in particular, we don't really like see or understand sort of like demons flying around in the kind of like, I don't know, cartoon devil kind of way.
Right.
We think we're, so far evolved past that, although there are plenty of cultures who understand and see demons in ways that we don't always see them. But in our culture, the way that demons are present is through white supremacy, through systems and institutions that are possessed, and that are webs that are so intricate that it is impossible to move through the world without sort of like becoming entangled in them. And yet that's our call, right? That's why we have God. We know who has already won. We know that our collective liberation will come. And so even though we're trapped by this sin of white supremacy and we can't free ourselves, we know that God has already won and will liberate all of us. And then the joy is that we are freed to work alongside God to free our neighbor.
Amen. Yeah, when we read The Cross and the Lynching Tree in one of my first theology classes at Lancaster Theological Seminary. And when I started going to church again after a very long absence, I heard the very gay pastor say that Jesus was executed as an enemy of the Roman state. And that was a phrase that I had never heard in all of the years that I'd been, in evangelical white Christian spaces. And you talk about this in the book, how that reframing, the Romans were the cops.
Right.
The religious elites were the collaborators. Jesus was lynched on a piece of wood that was used as state-sponsored terrorism by the empire. And we still see these kinds of things happening with the all too frequent, always tragic killings by racist cops and of Black Americans, of indigenous, of Latinx, anybody that's not white, basically, but predominantly Black Americans. And white supremacy as a concept makes no fucking sense to me. It just doesn't. It's just so monumentally stupid on its face.
Right.
Like there's nothing special about me because my DNA is 97% from the UK. It's just interesting if you're into that kind of interesting fact. But it doesn't fucking make me special, not even a little bit.
Right. Right. And I think that's part of the reason why, Michelle Alexander talks about like the new Jim Crow, right? I think it's like we've gotten to a point as a society, many of us have gotten to a point as a society. I won't say everyone, because there's definitely still explicit, obvious racism all around us. And it's getting louder and louder and louder and more uncovered. So I don't want to at all downplay that. But Michelle Alexander and other people have talked about how the way that racism now functions is sort of to like become invisible sort of like racism without racists, right? That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the reason for that is because it is like a ridiculous idea. It is a ridiculous idea that race, which is a construct, sort of can make someone better than another. And so even though it's this like fake thing that still sort of like makes all these rules about society, it's like it has to in some ways function on a level that is invisible or erased or subtle, because it's not an internally consistent argument, especially for those people who are Christians and people of faith, or just people of goodwill. But of course, as we know, Christians have been some of the worst perpetrators of racialized violence. And then on the flip side, of course, there have been Christians who have been very brave abolitionists, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly the religious and faith convictions of enslaved people who rose up, right? So it's like, yeah, it's such a good reminder to me. It's a little bit easier to notice it in history, right? Because again, we sort of become we sort of stop noticing the things that are around. The water that we're swimming in just becomes normal to us. So sometimes
Right.
looking back in history, seeing these patterns helps me to recognize the patterns like today in my own context and in my own life. But you look back at history and you look back at slavery, and you see that sort of like pro-slavery Christians and Christian abolitionists and enslaved people were all using the Bible to make their
Right.
arguments, right? They were all saying God's on their side. And so what that says to me, what's the reason that's convicting to me, is that it shows us that in every time and place, God raises up a faithful remnant. And in every generation, the church is sort of given a test. And the test is, will we cozy up to empire for the sake of our own perceived privilege and comfort? Or will we resist empire, and will we choose the path of liberation? And even in impossible situations, impossible odds, there has always been a faithful remnant. And so there's sort of no excuse, right? You can sometimes look back and say, oh, this was just normal then, or they didn't know that it was wrong, but there was always a voice in the wilderness
Right.
now. And so then today we think, right? What are the things today that it's sort of like, oh, we'll look back and say, oh, everyone just thought this way, right? And we can know actually that there are people who have been calling out, who have been the faithful remnant that God has raised up, who have been saying this is wrong. And it's more about, are we listening? Are we paying attention? Are we following those voices? Or are we just sort of uncritically internalizing the propaganda and allowing ourselves not to know better because we're not listening to those voices?
Right. Yeah. The person of their time, or as it's more commonly said, the man of their time argument just doesn't hold water for them anymore because of that faithful remnant of people who were doing the work in the face of what everybody knew to be true.
Right.
That there were white Christians and black Christians that were in the 19th century saying, no, the enslavement of African people is wrong. End
Right.
of.
Right.
And then there were people who started the Southern Baptist Convention that were like, the Christian golden rule doesn't prevent the enslavement of Africans because
Right.
they're not as smart as us.
Yeah.
And it's like, how the
right.
that logical leap makes no fucking sense whatsoever.
And something else that's really convicting about that is that there was also another group, right? There was another group of like abolitionists who are like, slavery is wrong. And they still believed in white supremacy, right? And
Right.
so that's really convicting to me, because I think that's like an easy place. A lot of times those of us who are more progressive, it's really easy to sort of like look outward and say, look at the conservatives, they don't get it, they're so bad, they're so wrong, right? And I think there's like, there's really a lot of value in speaking with clarity about what's going on. So I don't at all think that we shouldn't be really clear about, the violence and the harm that we're seeing. And at the same time, it's really easy, again, to sort of like look outward and point outward at how bad they are over there, and aren't we so good? And I can see that even a lot of us white people who consider ourselves progressive, maybe would have been in that category where we have the right beliefs about how slavery should end. And yet there's a major part of us that still sort of thinks of ourselves as better than, Black people or people of color, right? So I think, translating that to our own time and being like, how can we reflect on that, right? Even if I have the correct beliefs about which institutions should stop and which things should change, and even though if I'm really clear about those guys over there doing bad stuff, what are the ways I've still internalized some of these lies and they still have like a hold on me? And I know for myself, like, there's so many times that I look back and I'm like, wow, I really did not understand how much I had internalized some of these messages, right? And I know that even in a few years, I'll look back at myself now and feel that way too. But I think that's like, if our audience, if the people watching this probably are more like on the progressive side, I think it's like important to remember that like, yes, there's like the Christians who propped up slavery and used the Bible to defend slavery. And then there's like the brave abolitionists, and particularly like the brave enslaved people who like rose up and fought back, right? But then there was this other group who like agreed that slavery was wrong, but also did not think that white people and Black people were equal, really. And that's a hard thing to reckon with.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have to constantly interrogate our own embedded theologies, our own cultural, identities, and what we quote unquote know to be true, and all of that. You don't really talk about this much in the book, but you went from a white moderate. I mean, you do talk about the journey from white moderate to abolitionist, and by abolitionist, the carceral system, policing, and the whole state-sponsored terror that is modern American police forces. And as I've been trying to wrap my head around that for a while. Knowing some of the things that I know about the way racist cops are the root of it all, right? But I guess I have not read enough about the abolition movement, and you say in the book something to the effect of, I became an abolitionist before I got to the place of what does it look like on the other side. Right. And that's one of the places where I get stuck. Because I want to see Donald Trump and everybody in the Epstein files and everybody that's committing war crimes held to accountability to the fullest legal extent of the law.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I don't know what that looks like if those criminal predators and war criminals and so forth aren't imprisoned.
Right.
So have you come to an understanding of what that can look like? I've heard about restorative justice. I don't think Trump is capable.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So for and I know that these are the kind of the pendulum way over here, like what do we do about these kinds of things? But these clowns are running the show right now, right? Totally. So like what do we do in an abolitionist context with that level of evil and criminality? And maybe you don't know. I don't know.
I would say, so I'll first give I have, of course, a lot of thoughts on this, but I'll first give the disclaimer that I'm sort of like, I'm not a sociologist, right? And I'm not also the most directly impacted person, although I have, of course, as we've all been, of course, impacted by Donald Trump and this administration. I'm not the most directly impacted person. So I don't think that maybe I am the like have the total answer on this. And yes, I have like thought about some of this, right? So what I don't have is like the blueprint, right? Of like rolling out the blueprint and being like, this is the step-by-step of how it would work, because a lot of the abolitionist movement is also based on sort of like agency and community control. And so in different contexts, it can look different ways. You've talked about restorative justice. There's also transformative justice models, which are a little bit different. Some of these really important questions are grappled with in a lot of different resources. A really accessible one is transformharm.org. It has a lot of questions about like, so what do we do with rapists, right? What do we do with murderers, right? So there's some really good resources here. But what I will say is something that I really appreciate about the abolitionist movement. There's a couple of things. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, one of the architects of the abolitionist movement, said that abolition is about presence, not absence. So when you hear abolition, of course, you abolish, you get rid of, right? That's what you think of as things we get rid of: prisons, policing, right? Our sort of like racist carceral system. And that's part of it, right? But I don't know any abolitionists who are like, their abolitionist plan is sort of like throw open the doors and just be like, shrug, hope it works out, right?
Right, yeah.
It's about abolishing those things, but it's actually about building something. It's about building the kind of world where everyone has what they need to thrive, and building the kind of world where people do not have the kind of power to commit the kind of harm on the widespread level that we're seeing with Donald Trump. So that's one thing that I'll say. The other thing that I'll say, as far as accountability, is my imagination has often been so limited by our current carceral system and like the cop inside my head that it's really hard for me to imagine something different. But in our current system, what typically happens is that if someone, well, in our current system, before I get into what I was going to say, in our current system, what we're seeing happen is there's different rules for different people, and some people do whatever the fuck they want, right? But sort of the narrative in our current system is if somebody commits harm, that person is bad and they did a bad thing, and so they should be punished, right? And that's kind of the way that we understand justice is punishment, right? You did something bad should happen to you.
Right.
I think that part of learning about abolition and like building an abolitionist framework and abolitionist society is zooming out a little bit, and instead of saying you're a bad person, you did a bad thing, instead of, I think sometimes abolition sort of it sounds like less accountability, right? It sounds like less like, oh, we'll just sort of like all hug and kiss and skip off into the sunset and it'll be all la-di-da. But actually, that's the system we have right now, if you're rich enough. The system we have right now is just, we just all sort of kiss and make up and we all just pretend it didn't happen and we skip it off in the sun and there's no accountability. So the first thing to remember is that if you are rich in our current system, there's no accountability. So that's nuts. And that's a little bit like hard pill to swallow, because it's like, wow, we actually live in a just completely, like a complete free-for-all. If you are powerful and if you are vulnerable, then there is no safety or protection outside of what you have in community, right? But with an abolitionist framework, instead of zooming in on one person and saying, you're bad, you should be punished, you did something bad, so something bad should happen to you, an abolitionist framework zooms out a little bit and says, yes, we have accountability for this one person, but even more than that, we have accountability for the systems, the people, and the community, and the conditions that allowed this to happen. So when I think about Donald Trump, when I think about the current administration, I think about the rise of fascism. Abolition for me is not less accountability, it's more accountability. And the accountability is not, again, I don't really get to decide what happens to any of these people, but accountability is not necessarily punishment in the sort of narrow sense, although a lot of times if you have privilege, any kind of accountability feels like a lot of punishment, right? But I care very much about Donald Trump being held accountable. And even more than that, I care about zooming out to the decades-long system, hundreds of years-long system, right? The very foundation of this country built on these same principles that allowed this to happen: the white supremacy, the capitalism, the patriarchy, all of these things. The current system that we have has Donald Trump as some would say, charismatic sort of front person, but there's a lot of people behind the scenes and then a lot of systems that allowed that to happen. And so for me, abolition is not just what do we do about Donald Trump, which is an important question. It's what do we do to hold these people and these systems accountable. And even more important than that, abolition says, and then how can we build something better so that this never happens again?
Right. Yeah.
How can we build something that actually centers victims? That's something else about our current system. A lot of questions about abolition is like, is this fair to the victims to just sort of let the person that harms them skip off into the sunset, right? That's obviously not what abolition is, but sometimes that's the way it's painted.
Sure.
But our current system is actually incredibly traumatic for victims and is not victim-centered and doesn't provide victims any peace or real sense of justice or healing. And an abolitionist framework really centers victims. That's why, for example, in Illinois, I was part of, and I work alongside the Coalition to End Money Bond, which is a coalition of organizations all across Illinois that helped end money bond in Illinois. And
that's fantastic.
it was amazing. I was obviously, I was one tiny part of that, but it was so amazing to see. And it made a huge difference in the lives of a lot of people who aren't being held pre-trial. And it also strategically puts a crack in the system of mass incarceration. Doesn't end mass incarceration, doesn't end white supremacy, but it does put a crack in the system. And so one thing that I was really grateful, even though not all of the organizations and people who worked to end money bond were like explicitly abolitionist or would even consider themselves abolitionist. But that coalition, something that I thought was really key about what we were doing was that when we were working to end money bond, try to minimize pretrial detention, we worked alongside victim advocates for intimate partner violence and domestic violence, right? Because a lot of times opponents would be like, you must hate victims. you want to end mass incarceration, or you're an abolitionist. You must hate victims or not care about victims, or you couldn't possibly be a victim. But all the abolitionists I know are victims and survivors of violent crime. And when I have seen abolitionists, or at least people who are trying to dismantle mass incarceration, my experience has been in organizing that there is intentional and explicit centering of victims from the very beginning and working with organizations and experts so that victims actually have some sense of healing and a way forward. And of course, there's always more work to be done on that, right? I don't want to say in Illinois, we're always still, we're needing to protect the Pretrial Fairness Act and protect its implementation. And there's a lot that goes along with that. But the point being, right, that the sort of the question of accountability, our current system chews up victims and spits them out and doesn't treat them well at all and doesn't provide any sort of justice or healing. And so when it comes time, again, Donald Trump is like the big one to point to, but when it comes time for there to be some accountability there, like I trust abolitionists to center the most deeply affected people more than I trust our current system in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that's definitely a fair point. Thank you for that. I that's one of those things that I've struggled with too, because of lived experience, because of embedded cultural expectation, and all of those kinds of things.
You put me in fight or flight situations, like, baby, sometimes I'm going to fight. So like, I get it too,
Yeah.
It's, I really liked earlier when you said you're like an aspirational pacifist, right? I think if we're all, that's a very honest thing to say, because if we're all honest, we're aspirational about all of our values.
Right. Yeah.
We actually trust people a lot more when they say they're aspirational about their values. Like I'm an abolitionist in that's the lens that's the horizon that I'm moving towards. But in every action that I take, am I living into that? No, it's definitely aspirational, right? I try to be an abolitionist parent, right? I don't ground my kids, for example. They don't get grounded or anything like that. I try to, our home has been, the idea is that we all live here, we all make the rules together. When there's a problem, we come together and try to solve it together, right? So we try to do some abolitionist parenting. But it would be a lie to say that I always live into that, right? Like,
Sure.
It's definitely, abolition is an aspiration for me, even in my most personal, intimate relationships, let alone thinking about how to deal with the anger that we have for the very righteous anger for these systems.
Yeah. Well, the book is absolutely wonderful. I firmly
Mhm.
believe that majority white congregations in America should read this book because it shines a light on so much of white assumptions
Mhm.
and white complicity, white niceness, as you said, and that lack of endurance, that the
Mhm.
fragility that comes from comfort and all
Yeah.
of those kinds of things. And there was a quote, and in my notes I wrote page 135 quote damn in really big letters. And so I'm going to read that quote
Okay.
because broadly speaking,
Mm.
able-bodied white people can do more
Mhm. Definitely.
to, and it is our responsibility to dismantle a system that whiteness created.
Mhm. Mhm.
And this is the quote. If you are a white person and you are not experiencing some discomfort or loss in anti-racist work, you're not doing it right.
Mm.
This movement is not something you can visit as a tourist or observe and consume as a voyeur. It is a commitment.
Mm.
And from a theological perspective, whether you are an Orthodox Christian or a heterodox theologian like myself, that lands.
Yeah.
We have to be committed to loving our neighbors as ourselves. If I want to be comfortable in my home,
Mhm.
I have to. The teachings of Jesus compel me to want that for every other person, regardless of who they are.
Yeah.
And this idea that we can that God loves people that look like me more because of my Anglo-European ancestry is an idea that needs to go to the dustbin of history. It is
Yeah.
absurd and ridiculous. And as Jesus said, by your fruits you will be known. And
Mhm.
there is no good fruit in white supremacy.
Yep.
It is all putrid, and we need to compost white
Mhm.
supremacy forever because it's horseshit.
Absolutely.
Um, so thank you so much, Dr. Reverend Dr. Elle Dowd. Where can our listeners find you on the internet
Mm.
or in the street
Yeah.
or in the pulpit? Where can we find you?
Yeah, so I have a website, elledowd.com, and on that website there is a calendar that you can check out. For example, this live here is like on that calendar, so if people are wanting to see like where can you see me preach or speak, or where am I doing a workshop that's publicly available, that's on that calendar. You can also find me, I do a lot of public ministry on my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/elldowd ministry, and we do like a Wednesday night prayer group on Facebook Live. We're going to be having some monthly meetups for people who have survived spiritual abuse or religious trauma. We're going to actually, in part inspired by you, Dillon, but also there's like several people lately who have kind of been bringing Baptized in Teargas back up to me. We're going to start up this summer a book club where we read Baptized in Teargas together and discuss it chapter by chapter. At the end of each chapter, I know you know this because you read it, but not everybody knows this. At the end of each chapter, there's discussion questions and action items.
Yeah.
And so that's a thing that you, if you wanted to read and reflect and go a little deeper and discern some of these things in community and have, a little bit of a place to participate in an action reflection cycle where we can talk about things together and then commit to going out and doing the work and then coming back and talking about how it felt. You can check out that as well. But yeah, so I'd say facebook.com/elldowd ministry. You can go to elldowd.com if you want to put in a collaboration request or see my calendar, read my sermons. You can also find me on Threads and Instagram and my old stuff on Twitter or whatever, and Snapchat at How Now Brown Dowd.
That's a great name.
Thank you. Yeah, my unmarried last name was Brown, so I was
Oh,
Daniel
okay.
Brown. So one of the reasons, there's a few reasons, but one of the reasons I didn't keep my former last name when I got married, or like use both, was Brown Dowd, just like rhymed, and so it felt How Now Brown Dowd, How Now Brown Cow kind of thing. So anyway, How Now Brown Dowd is my handle on a lot of the other socials. But the main one is facebook.com/Elle Dowd Ministry. And you can also find me on my website.
Excellent. Now, what time is the Wednesday night gathering on Facebook?
Yeah, so Wednesday night Facebook Live gathering is typically on around 7 p.m. Central Time, but it does jump around a little bit every once in a while if I have, like there's one week that I'm bringing my kid to college orientation, right? So if you look on the calendar on the website, it'll tell you when, and it'll be in Central Time. And typically on my Facebook that day or the day before, I'll post an announcement. It's usually, I have like a graphic that's like a yellow background and a cartoon of me praying, and it'll be like, I'm going live at this time. So you can also look there, but it's also on the calendar, but it's typically in the evening, maybe like 7 o'clock.
Excellent. Okay. Well, if I can make it, I also do John Fugelsang's show on Wednesday nights. So on Tell Me Everything. So I'm not typically available, but sometimes you might see me pop up.
That'd be great.
The reason I said that about the book, about the churches, is because of those questions. I did not have obviously time to go through them all, but I think this would be a great book for church book groups and activist Christians to read together.
And I also, there's a lot of church groups that either read it and then have me physically come do like a weekend with like an author's event, workshop and preaching or something. Or if like that's inaccessible, like there's churches that have me pop in on a Zoom or something. And maybe it's like they've done the book club every week or every month or whatever. And then at the end they have me pop in and we do like a little discussion or Q&A or whatever. So I'm also happy to do that. You can reach out to me if your church is doing something like that. I know a lot of churches, for those churches that are more liturgically minded, a lot of churches have done like a Baptized in Teargas sort of book study during Lent or something, right? Like using a season of repentance and reflection to be like, really think about our complicity in white supremacy. So that's one idea, but yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me tonight and for writing this book. It's very vulnerable, it's raw, it's real, and vitally important for white Christian Americans to read. So get Baptized in Teargas. Check out Elle Dowd's website and like, subscribe, and share this podcast. We need more people to listen to voices like Elle's and even mine. And we need to dismantle the systems of oppression that keep us from seeing our neighbors like we see Jesus.
Absolutely.
And thank you, everybody. That's our show tonight. Hopefully Desimber will be back next week. I'm not exactly sure what happened. Hope she's okay. But we'll be back next week with another guest whose name escapes me because that's how I roll. All right. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week. How did I do that? Okay. I don't know how to do any of this. Very good.